So this is week one, looking at the lost world of the Dead Sea Scrolls. The primary source for this class over the next 5 weeks is a book called by Andrew Perrin. It's called The Lost Words and Forgotten Worlds. It is on just going through basically the story of the Dead Sea Scrolls and talking about them. I felt like reading it, you have like the world's best museum guide to talk to you about the Dead Sea Scrolls and their history and their significance and so forth. And so I've taken this book and sort of rearranged it in a different order to make more sense for a talk that I could break up into 5 weeks. And so this evening, we are going to look at the history of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So we're going to look at the story of basically how we went from the Dead Sea Scrolls to where we are today and what we know about them and where they are in the world. So the story of the Dead Sea Scrolls begins more than 2,000 years ago, but much of the history of the Dead Sea Scrolls is the most dormant, boring history of all time, because for the vast majority of it, nothing happened at all. But sometime between the years 300 BC and early in the first century, so those years 300 BC to early in the first century, we're talking about that period of time that takes place in a single page in our Bibles, and that is the white page between Malachi and Matthew, that intertestamental period. But sometime during that time period, there were a group of Jews who viewed the nation of Judea as so corrupt, viewed the priesthood as so given in to Greek and Roman culture that they viewed it as entirely irredeemable. So they saw their society, they saw the priesthood as so terrible that instead of trying to reform or change their own society and the people that lived around them, they were like, we're getting out of here. And so they left society, they left Judea, and went and sought refuge in the desert. And so the picture on the screen is the archaeology dig of the community of Qumran, which they established. And they lived in that community for 400 years in the desert region north of the Dead Sea. And this community, as you could imagine, a fairly boring community overall in the way that they lived, as you would expect for somebody who was obsessed with, living the law in detail and minutia. And what we know about them is basically they studied the Old Testament law, they debated about how you could practice it, and they were also well-versed in the contemporary writings of the Jewish community during that time period. And they copied many works, wrote some of their own works, and also collected works that were written for Jews during this period of time. And those writings that they copied themselves or collected, they went and they stored those writings in a series of caves in the wilderness near their settlement. Now, at some point in the first century, so we're talking around the time of the life of Christ, that community died out. And when they died out, their writings were forgotten. They were forgotten and left in those caves. They were stored in jars, left forgotten and undisturbed for almost 2,000 years. So for nearly 2,000 years, we had writings that were written in ancient Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, copies of the Bible and other writings, copies of writings that are without value in the world today. They are considered in the realm of priceless. And they just sat sitting in these caves year after year after year after year, until finally in the year 1947, when the scrolls were discovered, but maybe not in the way that everybody was told that they were discovered. So the most popular telling of the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls is that there was a wandering Bedouin shepherd boy by the name of Muhammad ad-Dahib. I probably butchered the pronunciation of his name. There's a picture of him on the screen. And Muhammad was searching for a sheep that was lost, they say. And he's searching for the sheep, looking for it wherever it could be, looking all throughout the wilderness. And as he was looking for the sheep, he was climbing up and down the limestone hills, And as he was walking, he saw an unusual sight of basically a hole, it looked like, in the side of the cliff. So you can see the picture of it there. So it looked like he saw this hole in the side of the cliff. And as a boy, boys do dumb things, saw this hole and thought, you know what? I want to see if I can throw a rock into that hole. And so he started to throw pebbles at it and throw rocks in it, and then throwing rocks in there until finally he throws one in and he hears a clank, a crash type sound. So he decides to investigate. So he climbs up the hillside, goes into the cavern, and once his eyes adjust to the darkness, he sees several large cylinder objects sitting before him. And this is where Bedouins are probably just far different than us. He sees these cylinder jars, and they scare him. And he is frightened by them. He's confused as to why they would be there. Like, how did they get up in this cave? The cave's even too small for a grown man to stand up in. And the whole thing just unnerved him. So he climbed down from the cavern, ran back home to his family of shepherds, and he tells them about the cave that he saw and what was in it. And so other shepherds from their little community, they decide to go and investigate as well. They climb up into the cave. They go inside. They tell people that the cave is possessed by evil spirits. I don't know if they're trying to just keep other people from eventually investigating into the cave, or if maybe they really did think that it was possessed. But once they go into this cave, they discover jars, scraps of paper, and more. And these shepherds take 3 scrolls from that cave, and they end up taking them to the town of Bethlehem. And once they come to the town of Bethlehem and they get in the hands of the right people, all of a sudden they realize how important these scrolls begin, and then the entire journey of the Dead Sea Scrolls begins. That's the official story of the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. In my opinion, it's probably not the true story. Why is it probably not the true story? Well, one, look at the area where the scrolls was discovered. So that's a picture of Cave 1. And my question is, are you going to graze sheep in an area like that at all? Like what is the possibility that this is going to be where you're going to graze your sheep? This is about as desolate and a dry region as you could imagine. People don't graze sheep in this type of an area today. This is not where you're going to have your sheep at. And then the fact that this boy would climb up to where this open cave is, yeah, maybe it would happen, but I don't find it all that probable. There's a certain romance to the story, though. Like this shepherd boy's just wandering, and he throws some stones like a boy, and breaks the jars, and that's how we find them. And it's also been accepted as well because there are other numerous archaeological discoveries from the mid to early 20th century in the region of Israel, where the discoveries were made because boys were goofing around and went into caves and found unbelievable discoveries. Like that's how we found the oldest known copy of, it's a small little copy of the Aaronic blessing that dates older than believed in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And that's our oldest known copy, and that was discovered by a couple of boys who went into a hole. They were told, don't go in there. They went in anyways and found the phylactery that contained that scroll. So there's a little bit of believability to it, but I look at that picture and I'm like, that just does not seem likely. But this is the official story. If you go to the Israel Museum in Jerusalem and go to the Shrine of the Book, where they hold the most important of the Dead Sea Scrolls, that is the story that they will tell you at the museum. But there's a book that was written by a scholar by the name of A. Powell Davies. This book was published in 1956. The book is called The Meaning of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Perrin cites this book in his work, that this book might actually hold the genuine story of the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Perrin's story also begins with Bedouins, but these Bedouins are not shepherds. These Bedouins are smugglers. And these smugglers are in the midst of transporting goods from the Transjordan River into Palestine. This is before the founding of the nation of Israel, so it still had that official designation of Palestine at that time period. And so they're looking to bring contraband into the region. And so they pass through the most desolated land so that they can get past any border crossings and bring their smuggled goods into the country. So they travel north of the Dead Sea. They stop by a well to replenish their supplies. And the Bedouin smugglers say that one common thing that they would do if they're stopped and camped in an area that's desolate like this, they would actually send their men out to go and look for caves, because they're hoping you find the right cave, you stumble into something that somebody forgot they put there. It could be really old, and stupid Westerners were paying lots of money for really old things at this time period, so that could be your moneymaker. And so they sent out their smugglers to go look around, and one of these traders stumbles upon this cavern. I shouldn't say stumble upon it. They see it up there and need to do the work to climb up into it. And they get into the cave. They take what looks to them to be the 3 scrolls that are in the best condition in this cave, and they take them to the town of Bethlehem in order to sell them. Now, which story is true, shepherds or smugglers, we'll probably never know. Maybe it's a combination of the two. Maybe they were shepherds who also had smugglers in their midst who are both involved in finding this. We don't know. But regardless, we have Bedouins who discover these scrolls kind of by chance either way and stumble upon them. But the key is, at some point in 1947, 3 scrolls are taken from the wilderness north of the Dead Sea and brought to a cellar in Bethlehem. The scrolls that they take are the first 3 scrolls that come out, which are the scrolls 1Q Isaiah A. Now, it has the title 1Q Isaiah A because it's a scroll of Isaiah. It was found in the first Qumran cave, so it's got the 1Q, and the A means this is our first scroll of Isaiah that we've been discovered. So 1Q Isaiah A, and then also they find the Pesher Habakkuk and the community rule. So these scrolls end up in Bethlehem. We're not sure how they end up in the hands of dealers by the name of Kahil Musa and Juma Mahmoud Khalil. Who knows what they paid the Bedouins? I mean, they probably could have paid them in coins or some sheep in order to get these scrolls. And then a 4th scroll is brought to them that was missed on the initial search because this scroll wasn't in one of the jars. Instead, this scroll was just sitting on the cave of the floor of the cave. And this scroll will end up being, for the first few years of the discovery, the most popular and the one that everybody wants to get their hands on, and that is the Genesis Apocryphon. And side note, we'll talk next week about the scrolls themselves. So if you think some of these titles are weird and you're like, what's the community rule? What's the Genesis Apocryphon? We'll talk about what documents we actually found in the Dead Sea Scrolls next week. But they bring these 4 scrolls to a dealer in Bethlehem. And it's just amazing that, like, the Genesis Apocryphon survived 2,000 years. Because while the other 3 were clearly stored in these jars for 2,000 years, the Genesis Apocryphon probably sat on the ground for 2,000 years waiting to be discovered. It was described as being basically a cigar, the way that it was wrapped up and all stuck together, and took some some creative technology and techniques to unravel it without completely destroying it. But these 4 hands are in the hands of these 2 dealers in Bethlehem, and then they are purchased by a man named Archbishop Samuel. And he will be the most colorful character of all of the story. Archbishop Samuel was the Archbishop of the Syrian Orthodox Church in Jerusalem. Later on, Archbishop Samuel will end up confessing how much he purchased the scrolls for, and he bought them for 16 Palestinian pounds, which equaled out to about $97 in 1947. So he buys the first 4 Dead Sea Scrolls. 3 of them are easily the most valuable and important of all the scrolls that will be discovered by far. And he bought them for less than $100. Just to put that in perspective, if one of us stumbled on a scrap of the Dead Sea Scrolls and you were able to authenticate that you had, like, you know, a chunky piece of the Dead Sea Scrolls in your possession, you got it authenticated, you put it up for auction, you would have the starting bid of your auction at probably $3 million. And you would have people lined up, museums, collectors, ready to throw that $3 million at you to purchase that one little scrap of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So that shows you the value that they end up having once we know all that we know about them. But let's go back to 1947 with our first 4 scrolls. So Archbishop Samuel gets these scrolls, receives them. He knows they're important, really has no idea how important they are. But this is 1947. The nation of Israel is getting ready to get established. There's so much conflict and trial in this area that Samuel decides, I need to get out of here. So he takes the scrolls, packs them up in a bag, and travels to America. And he travels to America, has them looked at by specialists at a few different universities and schools. So, which is crazy. There's a period of time where Samuel is traveling around the country, basically holding the Dead Sea Scrolls in his possession, which is just kind of nutty to think about with how today they're secure as you could possibly make these documents. And Samuel's for a while just kind of walking around with them. But he's getting them looked at, ends up getting the Genesis Apocryphon barely studied. Like they studied just the very outer layers of it. In the midst of the studying of it, some parts of it get destroyed. They kind of disintegrate in the guy's hands while he's looking at them. And they discover 2 important things. They discover, one, this document is written in Aramaic, which means not only do they know they have Hebrew, but they also have Aramaic. So all of a sudden now you have super old Hebrew, super old Aramaic, which basically makes it worth even more than what they would initially expected. But then the other thing that they discover, looking at the very outer layers of it, is that in the Genesis Apocryphon, they discover that there is writing in it that is the tale of Lamech from Genesis chapter 4. And you might be like, what in the world is the tale of Lamech? Well, Lamech is an obscure character in Genesis chapter 4. Lamech's the character that boasted about killing a man and having 2 wives. He's shown as the one who basically kicked off the events that would lead to the horrific character traits of the flood period. And there was a story that was told about the life of Lamech, filling in all the little details that somebody imagined the life of Lamech might be. Well, we didn't know the tale of Lamech existed until the Genesis Apocryphon was discovered. So not only now are they like, oh, we have another language, but oh, we have stories that were from 2,000 years ago that no one ever heard before. What else could be in here? And so now it's just like people are, their minds are being blown. At this point, there's a short blurb in Time magazine about the Dead Sea Scrolls. You can tell by the short article that they're not sure still what to make of this. Not really sure how profound they will end up being, but they make their way into Time magazine. And then Samuel ends up bringing the scrolls to Harvard. And as soon as the professors of Harvard get their hands on these scrolls and they realize, holy cow, like this is maybe the most important thing we're ever going to do, they immediately make so there's Archbishop Samuel there on the screen. And as soon as they get the scrolls on their hands, they make plans for a 6-month project to unroll and examine the Genesis Apocryphon. Well, they bring this plan to Samuel about this 6-month-long plan to unroll the Genesis Apocryphon. And as soon as they do that, Samuel takes back the scrolls from Harvard. He's like, whoa, you cannot do this. And the reason that he cannot do that is not because Samuel is interested or not in what's inside the scroll, but it's because Samuel still wants his payday. Like, he wants to make money on these scrolls. He wants to sell them. And he's afraid what'll happen if they unroll the Genesis Apocryphon is it'll be damaged, maybe it'll be completely destroyed, and then all of a sudden his big moneymaker is gone and he can't sell it. So at this point, Archbishop Samuel, I think he's clearly in over his head. Like, this is just a priest from the Orthodox Church who was in Jerusalem who just kind of stumbled upon these, bought them in a market. He isn't sure what to do, but he knows the one thing he wants his end goal to be, which is he wants to make some money on his $100 investment. So, and this is my favorite part of the whole story. And this sort of moment, I think, is why I wanted to end up saying this, because I just think that this is funny. So Archbishop Samuel isn't sure what to do. He's holding what could be the most valuable archaeological discovery in the entire world. And in order to sell it, he takes out an ad in the Wall Street Journal. There is a tiny little ad that starts with miscellaneous for sale, with a tiny box ad that reads, "The 4 Dead Sea Scrolls, biblical manuscripts dating back to at least 200 BC, are for sale. This would be an ideal gift to an educational or religious institution by an individual or group." And so he puts these up for sale with the Wall Street Journal. The Wall Street, he tries to run it even longer than he wanted to, but I think the Wall Street Journal kind of realized like the fire that they were playing with. They're like, no, you can't run this ad again. Like, this is the only time it's going to go. But people begin talking to him. Thankfully, it has a happy ending for who ends up buying it, because there's one person who realizes, I know how important this is, and I got to make sure that my people get it. And that is a man by the name of Yigal Yadin. Yigal Yadin was a former soldier and the leading archaeologist for the nation of Israel. And Yadin sees the value of these scrolls and purchases the 4 scrolls for the nation of Israel for $250,000. So they end up having a happy story. The nation of Israel still has them today. They're held in the city of Jerusalem in the Shrine of the Book. They're kept there very secure. And I would say the people you would kind of want to have them. So it's a wonderful ending for that. But at this moment, can you just imagine what would happen now? So they discover these scrolls in the wilderness, and somebody just paid $250,000 for the ones that were pulled out. So what begins to happen is the search for the rest of the scrolls. And apparently you have 2 groups of people that are out there looking for the scrolls. You have your archaeologist Indiana Jones type. If you remember, Indiana Jones is typed for the museum, in the movies. He always wants to find things for the museum. I need this for history and for science. This needs to be studied. And he was so altruistic in all that he was doing. And then there were the villains in the Indiana Jones movie, like Belloc in the first movie, the French archaeologist who wanted to find things simply to sell them, who ended up teaming up with the Nazis because they would pay him the most money to find the Ark of the Covenant. So you had both groups searching for these scrolls, those who wanted them in museums, the nation of Israel's looking for them, and then also your regular old treasure hunters. And this would mean that a lot of the scrolls would end up in museums, in formal collections, but then you would also have scrolls that would end up being sold to the highest bidder for whoever could find them. And they end up searching in the wilderness, and they end up finding many more scrolls than they would have ever predicted. Because it's not just the one cave where they find scrolls. They end up finding 12 main caves that they discovered with scrolls in them. And in the caves, they not only find more Dead Sea Scrolls, they find a collection of jars, potteries, and lots and lots and lots of scraps. So for instance, in the most famous cave, that's the one we've already discussed, discovered by the Bedouins that you see in the pictures of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Cave number 1 contained 7 scrolls. It contained 600 fragments that ranged in various size and readability. And together, it's believed that they represented 69 different manuscripts. And all in told in that cave, there were 50 jars, bowls, pots, 4 lamps, 3 phylacteries. If you remember hearing anybody talk about a phylactery was a scripture holder where they would actually, wear the scripture in them, and they'd, wrap it on their arm or put it on their forehead. And so they'd have these little jars that had these little tiny scraps of paper in them that would contain copies of scripture, usually just a couple of verses. The Aaronic blessing was the most common scripture that was held in phylacteries. And they found the amazing discovery of phylacteries that actually still had the scrolls, the little first copies of scripture in them. They found wooden combs and linens that also survived the years thanks to the climate. Now, if you were to go to the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, to go to the Shrine of the Book, where the major Dead Sea Scrolls are held today, most of the exhibits that you're going to see in that museum are the stuff that they found in the cave, the jars, the combs, the phylactery items, because sadly, after the October 7th, 2023 attack on the nation of Israel, they took all of the scrolls off display and they've been holding them in secure locations since then, because who knows what's going to happen in the nation. And so they're not on display at this time at the moment, but they have a perfect facsimile of the great Isaiah scroll that's available for everybody to see. That's probably the most well-crafted one that we have. An example, another cave, cave number 4. Cave number 4 contained the most artifacts and scrolls of any other cave. And to show you what scholars and specialists are dealing with trying to translate and work on the Dead Sea Scrolls, in cave number 4, they found 15,000 manuscript fragments. So 15,000 pieces of parchment and papyrus in cave 4. It's believed that that cave was dug entirely by hand. It was created artificially by the Essenes and used for storage. But when looking at the overall 12 caves, Andrew Perrin said that the Dead Sea Scrolls really have the wrong name. We should really just call them the Dead Sea Scraps, because by and large, 98% of what you're going to find are scraps, little pieces like that where you're trying to piece together what it actually says. 11 of the 12 caves that had scrolls in them were all discovered from the years 1947 to 1956. So in the first 9 years, they find 11 of the 12 scrolls, 11 of the 12 caves with scrolls in them. The 12th cave, which ends up being labeled cave number 53, because caves 12 to 52 had no scrolls in them. But cave number 53 wasn't discovered until 2017. So only 8 years ago did they discover the last cave that still had storage jars along with what were labeled scroll remnants. So who knows how much was readable in those scroll remnants that have been discovered. And so scholars have spent years translating, trying to piece these documents together. Andrew Perrin writes in Lost Words and Forgotten Worlds, the reason that he learned ancient Hebrew, this is even a more ancient Hebrew script than what we have in the Hebrew Bibles that we use today. The reason that he got into the ancient Hebrew script and began to work on the Dead Sea Scrolls is because even today, you can be working on your PhD, you don't even need to be all the way through it, and you could have some scraps of the Dead Sea Scrolls that they're like, we need you to work on, and you're working on fresh stuff that nobody's seen in 2,000 years, that nobody's ever had a chance to study, just because there's so many different scraps and pieces to look at that we're still going through a lot of that even today. So we're still discovering new things with this discovery. But the biggest issue with the scrolls over the last several years, and in the grand scheme of things, this is relatively minor, that I would say, but it's rather interesting to discuss. And it's the fact that the Dead Sea Scrolls dashed the hopes of what a lot of people thought they would find when we discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls. There were a certain group of scholars who had assumed that the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls would result in the downfall of Judaism and Christianity. Because there's a popular view in the 19th, early 20th century that if we could find very old copies of the Hebrew Bible, especially we could find copies of the Hebrew Bible that dated before the time of Jesus Christ, it would uncover how much the Old Testament has been altered, how much it was changed generation after generation, year after year, and it would prove that the Hebrew Bible was nothing more than an ever-revolving fiction that can't truly be trusted. Well, the Dead Sea Scrolls, as we'll talk about more later on in this series, will end up showing that the biggest impact of the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls has been to prove the reliability or the stability of the biblical text. And that is, there were no massive discoveries, but people really wanted those. And not only did people really want those, groundbreaking, revolutionary discoveries, but they also wanted to own a piece of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so when it comes to the Dead Sea Scrolls and other manuscripts that are discovered from that region, even those that aren't specifically considered Dead Sea Scrolls, what's become the biggest issue in this subject over the last few years is the issue of forgeries. And forgeries coming from, you would say, both sides of the aisle, the conservative side and the liberal side. On the liberal side, we had one forgery that was made public by a woman by the name of Karen King in 2012. And the manuscript that she brought forward was titled The Gospel of Jesus' Wife. The Gospel of Jesus' Wife was a 4 by 8 centimeter wide scrap that had 7 lines of text on it that revealed that Jesus was happily married to Mary Magdalene all the time. And so this was put as a very ancient manuscript discovered in the same region as the Dead Sea Scrolls, proving that there were these destroyed documents from early in church history that showed that Jesus was married. Well, it was quickly discovered that it was a forgery. It was a fake. It was not dated to the time of Christ, but it was created simply for the purpose of being a forgery. But then there are other people, when it comes to the Dead Sea Scrolls, both private estates and museums, who want nothing more in the world to own part of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Like that is like the pinnacle of archaeological artifacts to own right now, especially if you're in the Christian circles, is to own a piece of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the biggest driver in the rising value and price of pieces of the Dead Sea Scrolls turns out to be the family that owns the Hobby Lobby. So the family that owns the Hobby Lobby, they use their millions, I don't know, maybe they have billions of dollars from owning the Hobby Lobby, but they've used a lot of their money to collect and pay for biblical artifacts and manuscripts. And they are also the financial arm behind the Museum of the Bible. So if you go to see the Museum of the Bible, I don't know, I wonder if somewhere when you first walk into it, there's a sign that's like, brought to you by the Hobby Lobby. Because their family is, the Museum of the Bible is basically their family's museum collection of the artifacts that they've had. And so they built a big museum for it in Washington, D.C. But of course, if you have collected all these biblical manuscripts and you're going to start the Museum of the Bible, what is the one thing you're going to want on display at the Museum of the Bible? You're going to want copies of the oldest manuscripts of the Bible that are known. And so it just happened to work out that around the time period that they began the early talks about the Museum of the Bible, in the late 80s and early 2000s, a group of Dead Sea Scroll scraps or partial parts of scrolls all of a sudden appeared on the market available for purchase. And so these pieces of the Dead Sea Scrolls showed up on the market for purchase, and they were scooped up and purchased by the Museum of the Bible, Azusa Pacific University, Southwestern Theological Seminary, the Lanier Theological Library, and the Schoheim Collection in Norway. So the group of them together all bought certain numbers of these manuscripts that were available to sell. But in a series of embarrassing announcements, probably around 20 years after they originally purchased, so this took place in the year 2020. Lots of other things were making the news in the year 2020, so if you didn't hear about this news, not surprised about that. But the Museum of the Bible, followed quickly by Southwestern Seminary, and other groups, announced that their manuscripts that they purchased for unknown amounts, but most likely very high prices in the millions, the manuscripts that they purchased were fake. All in all, during those years, 54 different Dead Sea Scroll manuscripts were sold and purchased in that time period. And out of the 54 different manuscripts that were purchased during those years, 52 out of 54 were fake. The Schoheim collection got, I guess, the lucky thing of getting the 2 ones that ended up being the genuine article. But out of those 54 manuscripts that were purchased, you could sort of see that they were probably too good to be true. Because out of those 54 manuscripts that were put up for sale, they were all copies of the scripture. So they were all portions of the Hebrew Bible. They all ranged in size from a single verse up to 10 verses in length. And that's what all of those groups wanted to own. They all wanted to own a piece of the Bible. They didn't just simply want Dead Sea Scroll manuscripts. They wanted Dead Sea Scroll manuscripts that are scripture. And I think if the history of the Dead Sea Scroll has taught us anything, And that is, for the most part, if something sounds too good to be true, it probably is too good to be true. If you hear about an archaeological discovery and you're like, oh, that fits exactly with what I was hoping they were going to discover. Or another group is like, ha, we found the magic bullet that's going to prove that everything that they believe was wrong. If either group falls into that category, what was discovered most likely probably isn't real. It's probably not the genuine McCoy. Because Aaron Perrin also lists all 54 of those manuscripts in his book, talks about what scripture passages that they have. One of the other interesting things is that not only were those manuscripts all 54 passages of scripture, but most of them were what I would call theologically interesting passages. Passages where you'd be like, oh, it would be interesting to see what those verses would say from 2,000 years ago, ones that you would kind of be a little intrigued about to look at and discover. But when you look at the Dead Sea Scrolls as a whole, the Dead Sea Scrolls as a whole aren't all Bible. The Dead Sea Scrolls as a whole aren't really all that interesting. In fact, the most boring book that I have ever read in my entire life is a book that I have that is simply English translations of the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's the most boring thing I've ever read in my life, because not only did they collect copies of scripture, but also the Essenes were obsessed with minute obedience to the Mosaic Law. You want to read something boring, read about minute obedience to the Mosaic Law. They were also obsessed with calendars and datings, and we'll talk a little bit about that next week. You want to read something boring, read somebody write about the differences between the lunar calendar and the solar calendar, and the Roman calendar and the Jewish calendar and the Essene calendar, all in the first century. Oh my word, that stuff is just like, who cares? And that's what a lot of the Dead Sea Scrolls are about, because that's what the Essenes cared about. So if all of a sudden somebody is selling 54 different manuscript pieces, and they're all interesting passages of scripture that Southwestern Seminary and the Museum of the Bible would really love to display, well, it's probably too good to be true. So I think we can get a good lesson from the Dead Sea Scrolls and the history of it, and that is there are going to be times in our life where we're going to hear news about this discovery or that discovery, and always the wise thing to do is to pause and step back and say, I'm going to wait a little while and let people dig into this a little more, have a little bit more in-depth study before I rush to make any kind of judgment about it. Because when it comes to old archaeological discovery, the hard thing about the world in which we live, the majority of them are just fake. They're not real. That's one of the things that makes the overall discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls so fascinating, is because we actually found something real. And it ended up not being as groundbreaking as people wanted it to be, but for us in the church, I think it has immense importance for us, and we'll talk about that. But it doesn't have the shell shocks that people wanted it to have. I mean, I even got duped on this with one of the channels that I have on one of the videos I made on my YouTube channel is about a book that a guy wrote about how one of the scraps that are in the Dead Sea Scrolls is a piece from the Gospel of Mark. And that because of that, we can date the Gospel of Mark to probably the late 40s. And the guy makes a pretty good argument about that piece possibly representing the Gospel of Mark. And I was like, after reading his argument, I think this is great. But after reading what Perrin said and then doing a bunch of other research and reading what other people have to say, I'm like, yeah, I got duped. I got a video of him online talking about how he just found this old manuscript of the Gospel of Mark, but it's not the Gospel of Mark. It's a Greek manuscript and we don't know what it is. And so we just need to be careful when we see, especially archaeological discoveries. We see things that are people post on YouTube. We just need to be careful not to swallow things hook, line, and sinker and immediately see. As they say, if you see it online, there's a good chance somebody's making it up and somebody's trying to dupe you. So you should probably wait till somebody has time to write a couple of books on it. Make sure it gets some serious study into it, because it's probably not a major headline. It's probably a scandal. So we should just be patient with the things that we learn about and take in. But that's the history of the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And it's time up to today. And what we will look at next week will be actually what are the Dead Sea Scrolls. And this, I think, actually is probably going to be the hardest part of the research. I'm working on it right now. But lists of what documents you find in the Dead Sea Scrolls is actually rather hard to come by. I've had to look in all these different sources and kind of piece them together to see what actually, I know we have the Great Isaiah Scroll, I know we have the Community Rule, but what else do we find in all those scrolls, so in all those caves? So next week we'll be talking about what actually are the books and the documents, and what did we learn about and find from the Dead Sea Scrolls. So we'll be looking at that next week. And then the week after that, we'll look at the Essenes. And so we'll talk about that community that lived out in the desert for 400 years and what we know about them now, those fascinating group of people. In the last 2 weeks, we'll talk about how the Dead Sea Scrolls intersect with what we know about the Bible, how they interact with what we've come to discover from there, and the most significant changes. And there's a few places where I think we can change the script a little bit in the text, where some verses that got kind of left out, we can see get put back in from the Dead Sea Scrolls, and we can see some of those minor changes, and we'll talk about those in the last 2 weeks.